I have a question, and I apologize in advance, and this may be a little bit technical, but I have a question about the zone of endangerment calculation and the area of review that was chosen. And obviously the significance of this is that in part it matters whose water well gets tested, whose water well is considered for protection. So I wanted to ask a very, very specific question about the calculation. In the application material, I think this might have been the fourth module, Tetra Tech, which was the company that I guess Bear Lake farmed out the calculation to. They provided, among other things, an equation I know that you all are familiar with from EPA, the Matkins and Russell equation, in order to measure, among other things, the pressure increase in the injection well as a result of injection. And a lot of the input values that were used for that equation seem to be problematic for a few reasons. And I'm going to state some things. If they're incorrect, please let me know why they're incorrect and let me know how we can come across the information for the correction. For example, some of the input values for permeability, the input value that was actually used in the applicant's formula was 100 millidarcies. That tends to be a very generalized input value that can be used in certain equations, but you can also obtain site-specific values if you have certain data to go off of. And it seems like there was data here because there were injection tests done prior. So I have a number of questions based on this. One, why is it the case that the 100 millidarcy value for permeability was accepted when there seemed to be data where you could have come up with a more site-specific input value that would be a lot less liberal and more accurate? There seemed to be, in the application, a lot of input values where the sources for those input values were completely missing. Now again, if some of the things I'm stating are incorrect, let me know. But it's extremely hard during the public notice and comment process. Everybody's going to come at this from different angles. But to the extent that someone wants to do a real technical evaluation of this, it's extremely difficult when they don't have the sources for those values. We're not sure whether some of these input values, for example, for injection formation pressure, viscosity value, compressibility, for rock compressibilities and fluid compressibilities, the sources for these were missing. They seem to be taken from I don't know where, and nothing appears to be site-specific using data that I think both the applicant and the EPA had access to. Please, if you could please comment on all of that, and I have three very specific questions based on all of that. One, Karen, I believe you said earlier that the zone of endangering influence calculation was something that EPA both looked at and performed.
We also did it ourselves. Yeah.
Right. So I'm curious to know, during the public notice and comment process, so far as I'm aware, your calculations were never provided, and a lot of what the EPA may have done was never provided to the public for comparison's sake. One, I'd like to know, did the Environmental Protection Agency use different input values from the ones provided by the applicant, different equations than the ones provided by the applicant? That's number one. I'm curious to know why those things that the EPA did were not provided to the public during the public notice and comment process. And to the extent that they actually weren't, I hope that EPA would be willing to release that information to the public now for review and consideration. Finally, I'd like to know whether why there wasn't data used, again, from prior tests that the applicant had its hands on. Why wasn't data used in order to change the input value so that they could be much more representative of the actual site?
When the applicant submits their zone of endangered influence calculation, we'll look at the values that obviously they send in. They provided information from an offset well that they had available to them. That was the information they used to do their calculation. We don't necessarily use the same parameters that they provide to us. But what's key is, you mentioned 100 millidarcies, which is fairly large value. So if you input that into, and I mentioned it might not be the same equation that you referenced. We use, it's a modified Tice equation, and I can send you the information on what we use. But if you use that 100 millidarcies, and you can still see through the calculation that it's not going to cause a huge zone of endangering influence, then by even using a smaller number, it's not going to make any difference. It's going to make it even less. So I can show you the parameter inputs that we used. We have them available. It's part of our record, and we do say in our public notice, information of public record is available.
So these equations and all the parameters, they're all available if someone would request them? Okay. Could you answer the question about why site-specific information that was available wasn't used to calculate more representative and accurate values? I mean, on the millidarcies point, for example, if those millidarcies change, the area of review, the zone of endangering calculation that leads to the area of review, could be altered. We're never told, by the way, so far as I know, in the application materials, what the zone of endangering influence calculation result was. Not part of the application. If it was part of the EPA materials, that's great, and I hope that they'll be made available to the public. But I'm curious to know, why wasn't information provided? You say that the offset well was potentially where they got this information from. So far as I know, not mentioned, data not given in the application in order to verify whether the offset well data itself was accurate, and second, whether when compared to the formation that we have here and the known values that we have here, whether it was representative. It seems odd to me that someone would use another well's data when they have their own well that they had retrieved data from in the past. Various logs and data from those various logs. I'm curious to know why you accepted an offset well as being accurate and verifiable when you, I think, knew that the applicant had its own data to go off of from the very same wells into which it wanted to inject.
Why an operator would have data for one well and not another well, I don't know. That's not up to me. I'm not out there doing that at the time. I'm not getting that. I'm getting the data from what's submitted to me. The offset well is in the same formation. It's in the same field. So it's into the Medina. It probably isn't more than a couple thousand feet away. So it's representative in my view. The data was in the application. Have you seen the application?
The application was on record at the public library during the period of
Yes, I'm not sure which data you're talking about. In their Matthews and Russell equation, they give extremely rounded input values. I mean, 100 millidarcies, if someone happened to arrive at 100 millidarcies using accurate data, I suppose it's possible. You could arrive at a lot of values using accurate data. It seems odd to me, considering the fact that 100 millidarcies is a value that's often used in textbooks and studies as a sample input value. If it was the real one that was arrived at through real data, real calculations, I'd be surprised, but I'd be pleasantly surprised. But it does seem rounded off.
Do you recall I mentioned to you that we sent a notice of deficiency?
Yes.
That was one of the questions we asked them. Again, we can share with you our calculations. I mean, it's part of the public record. It's not the same equation they use, so you're going to probably get a little bit different result.
See the monitoring wells too.
Yeah, and go ahead.
Well, actually, the monitoring wells are an important aspect of the permit as well, to verify the models that were submitted for that very reason, because of the input values may not have been as accurate as they could have been or should have been. So that I mean, real-time data is the best means by which to verify or to model what's taking place.
And with those equations, there's some really key variables, some more than others. Obviously, permeability is a key. Thickness is a key.
Compressibility, would you agree, is key?
I'm sorry?
Compressibility?
Not as much. No. Generally, if you look at most of the equations that are used, or that becomes more of a common variable that's used throughout, not just our calculations, but throughout EPA. So compressibility, no, unless
some multiple wells.
But that is exactly why we're incorporating more monitoring wells into our permit applications, especially in areas where there are potentially abandoned wells outside the area.
Although these monitoring wells are coming in after. So in other words, and I believe me, I don't think anyone, after the application has been submitted.
But we required them.
Prior to injection.
Prior to injection,
Yes.
sure, right, but in other words, so far as I know, the data from these monitoring wells was not used in the equation that they developed in order to figure out the area of review, that was, and all I'm saying is, I think you're right, that real-time data from those kinds of wells, can be used. And if you say that, the sources for these input values are revealed in some of the documents that you have that may not have been in the application, I mean, of course, we welcome seeing those, and I suppose we'll request them. But I just wanted to make sure people understood that you're talking about monitoring wells that were not producing data that would be used for the formation of the equation.
After the wells are put into operation to verify.
To verify the accuracy of the
Sure.
reaction.
All right, we'll go over here, and then back there, and then up here. So I have my next, then you're fourth.